Hello and welcome to this session of part one of Tomorrow's World and its risks, opportunities and choices for Europe. It's called part one because there will be another opportunity to dive into these issues later today. But we're going to have this opening session on this very broad theme of Europe's future. We're very fortunate to be joined by Federica Mogherini, Rector of the College of Europe in Bruges, who's joining us on screen, and Pierre Vimont, former Ambassador of France to the United States and the European Union, and of course very distinguished diplomat here in Brussels as well. And here in the room, we have Cloos, recently retired as Secretary General of the Council of the European Union. So we're in a moment where the world is very clearly changing rather rapidly around us. And there's a really excellent report on the acceleration of changes prepared by Florence Gaub of the ISS in Paris. She'll be speaking later today. And in that report, she points out the acceleration of trends that have been happening globally even since the last foresight exercise that ESPAS undertook. She points out how much both climate has changed faster than expected in very frightening ways, where the acceleration both of global warming and indeed of the now irreversibility of sea level rise and other tipping points that will fundamentally change our environment and indeed our security are now there for all to see. And yet, as we saw in Glasgow last week, it's still extremely difficult to get a matching acceleration in commitments and action across the globe. She also points out how much the pandemic has driven further digitalization of the economy and indeed of everyone's daily lives with hybrid events like this one, but also how much that's changing the labor market and the social impact that that's having. And I just take out one more of the very interesting trends that she points out, how much trade has been changed also by the pandemic, with actually there's still a great deal of shipping of goods going on around the world, but a very deep interdependence and deep connectedness that means that geopolitical competition is much harder to manage because it has direct and immediate effects on the linkages between great powers in terms of economics, trade, and indeed, of course, human contacts, which was never there during the Cold War, where the economic systems were largely isolated from one another. So a lot of very interesting things to discuss. We'll open with remarks from Federica Mogherini, and then we'll go into a conversation and I hope some lively debate between three actors who've been fundamental to shaping European foreign and security policies over the past 10 years. And great to have all three of them now in their post-office role, where they can speak freely to us about the challenges they faced and how they would like to see Europe responding in the future. So over to you, first of all, Rector Mogherini.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet, even if only virtually, you and obviously my close friends, both Pierre and Jim. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with you. And it's a pleasure to comment on this excellent report and try to project ourselves in the long-term future, because it's true that most of the time we are discussing and debating and commenting on the current trends or the near future and Europe's reaction to that, or the policies that need to be put in place to react to them efficiently. But I think it is extremely valuable to try and project ourselves as trying to do with this exercise 30, 40 years from now and try to get prepared for that at this stage. And indeed, it is a privilege to be able to do so in having a position, let's put it this way, having seen things from within the institutions, but also now being free and not expressing anybody else's views but our own ones. The first question that came to my mind when reflecting upon the trends 40 years from now, it's been looking back 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, I was 8 years old and the world was a completely different place. And most of the things we are living today, even this very same meeting, was completely inconceivable. Nobody had a little computer at home, not to mention mobile phones. Pandemics were a memory of the past. Climate change was hardly imaginable as a major problem in the future. pollution was, but climate change as such was not in the radar screen. The world was divided in two. Tensions were clear, and challenges and threats were clear. And even if it was frightening and scary, somehow the boundaries of our actions and our policies and politics were rather determined. And in these last 40 years, the changes that have happened have been so fast, so accelerated, even more so in the last few years. I think that's what happened in the last 2-3 years could hardly be foreseen by most of us before. And I think that if we have one certainty today is that there is no predictability possible for the near future or for the next 40 years. I know that this might put us in a very difficult position on debating something that is definitely not foreseeable at this stage, but I think that if we have one predictable thing is the unpredictability of the future developments. As in the last couple of decades, we have had unpredictable trends develop. Looking at the trends, I think the report points out very clearly and very well the major challenges that the world and also Europe is going to face in the next decade, in the coming decades. Climate change being clearly the first one that has an impact on everything else, starting from security, but also geopolitics, economy, and the way in which even our urban life develops. I think that we will have to think and rethink of how our countries are organized, our transports are organized, our cities are organized, either to face the effects of global change or to try to contain and limit them. But also, and clearly, I think we will be faced to continued cycles of challenging pandemics or sanitary situations that might require extraordinary measures. And this, I think, would imply clearly major investments shifting from some areas that have been major areas of investment so far, including in Europe, to probably more attention to research and all the science sector that we have found out in the last couple of years, probably the only resource that we cannot replace with anything else: knowledge, development of technology, and the supply chain of healthcare products, including vaccines and medications. Then, if we think 40 years from now, if I can throw in a provocative thought, the answer of my daughter to the question, where we will be in 40 years from now, how will the world will look like, she would probably say, "Don't worry, Mom, about that, because we will all be dead." Now, I'm not saying that this generation that is growing up now is a pessimistic one, but it's probably very realistic on the fact that if we don't act very boldly on the challenges that we see today already as serious ones, we'll probably not even have a future to think about at all. And I think that this element has to be taken seriously, because we have seen the last 2 years that nature is not something that the human being can control. It can spoil it, but it can ruin it, but it cannot definitely master it beyond a certain limit. Coming to geopolitics and security trends, I think that if we project the European Union role in the world 20, 30, 40 years from now, my guess is that, first of all, we will continue to see a strong European Union. I've always been convinced, including in the years of my mandate, and I've shared some of those years, both with Pierre Vimont and with Jim Cloos, and they know what my feelings were, including in the times of the Brexit referendum. I've always been convinced that the fact that one member state decided to leave would have been actually a reminder for the other 27 of what is there that we risk to lose if we get out of the Union. And I think it is a sort of deterrent also for others to maybe play with words, but not with acts, and value what the European Union gives to European citizens that sometimes we keep for granted and that can be reversible, including security and peace. That is not that old on our continent. It is only 70 years of peace, which is not that much. It's enough to look at the Balkans to remind ourselves that conflicts in Europe are still possible, and reconciliation has a value that should not be underestimated, including not only for security reasons, but including on economic and stability reasons. But I think that's 20, 30, 40 years from now, we will still have a strong European Union. I think that we will see a European Union that will probably differentiate circles of speed and intensity and depth of decision-making and action in different circles, with probably cooperations at different levels that might go beyond the full membership, within the full membership and beyond. I hope, but I'm not sure, we will have a Europe that will not be a 27, but will include new member states, namely in the Balkans. And I think we will have a role for the European Union in the future that will be still very important, probably even more important in the future than today. Why do I say so? Because obviously one of the trends that also the report highlights of the tensions between the United States and China and the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific will probably move the pole of the attention geostrategically, geopolitically in the Indo-Pacific region, but will probably leave for Europe and for our part of the world and from our, I would say, actorness in the world, probably the space to play the role and the part of the smart power, the power that tries to create norms and values, or at least affirm and expand norms and values worldwide. I'm not sure we can still refer globally to a legal-based global order, but I'm convinced that regardless of contradictions inside the European borders, this still will be the DNA of our continent, of our union. And I think that's, we will see in the future more and more the European Union called to act to play that role. Which will not be, I think, an easy role. I think that conflicts and tensions will exacerbate even further in the future, as we are seeing in this last decade. But I think that this will call for a responsible European Union more and more in the future. To close, without being too pessimistic or to raise too many alarms, but I was reflecting on the last 20 years, and because when you try to project yourself long term, I think it's wise to have step back and look the same amount of years you're considering in the future in the past. And in particular in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, we have lived in the last 20 years an impressive series of crises, one after the other, one more dramatic than the other, and each of them hard to be predicted before. And if you put them in order, well, some of them were predictable, definitely so, and ignored. So I think that this is one of the lessons to be learned. Once you have a warning on a crisis, take it seriously and get ready for facing it, which we didn't do with the pandemic, which we didn't do with climate change, which we didn't do with the migration crisis. So this is probably one element to keep in mind for shaping Europe's future. Preparedness and allocating enough resources and political investments on the crisis that we see coming, without thinking that putting the dust under the carpets will solve the problem from now to the next election, and then the next generation of leaders will deal with them. This doesn't work, clearly. But if you see the sequence of crises we faced from the beginning of the century, the millennium, to here, again, you see an acceleration on the frequency and the seriousness of crisis and the impact of crisis. The financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the migration and refugee crisis that I will always repeat has been more of a crisis for the refugees themselves than for Europeans, but the impact on Europe has been also politically relevant. The effect of climate change, including on our continent, which is something that 20 years ago we couldn't imagine, and that we see now every day. Speaking from Belgium, that is quite dramatic to see the effects of the floods this summer and the fires and the floods even now in parts of Europe. The pandemic now and a series of other crises that have developed over time. This to say, including some challenges to our values and our democratic systems that we would have probably not foreseen at this level, to this extent, a few decades ago, where there was a certain enthusiasm in the push for democratization of countries in the east of Europe. We are seeing now values and rule of law, democracy, human rights challenged in the very heart of our societies and our democracies. This to say that I'm afraid that the biggest challenge we will have projecting ourselves in the future will be our relationship with the planet, taking this in the form of climate change or pandemics, a growing tension and conflictuality worldwide, where Europe will probably be called and have an interest to play the moderator effect, or trying to bring rationality in an irrational dynamic of conflictuality. I'm not an economist. I will not go into the effects that all of this could have on global economy and on European economy, but I guess some. And in general terms, for sure, also a demographic crisis, compensated potentially by movement of people worldwide, because we have a demographic crisis in Europe that is the opposite of the demographic crisis that you face in Africa or in Asia. So probably you will see in the next 40 years also trends and movements of people growing with the connected instabilities and tensions that this would bring if not governed rationally. Why I say rationally? Because I've always been convinced we still have not found the courage to say that in Europe we need migrants for economic and demographic reasons. As long as the political discourse doesn't face the reality of facts, I think that challenges of the future will be difficult to handle. So I see this acceleration of crisis. I see Europe in a good place to manage to handle them. At the end of the day, in the last couple of decades, and in particular in the last few years, I think the European Union has been extremely well equipped to respond to crisis. I think the response to COVID in particular has been remarkable and unexpectedly so, I have to say. I think some lessons from the past were drawn, and in particular the resilience and recovery plans, I think, has shown a different face of the European Union, a European Union that is able to react even beyond its own competencies, strictly speaking. But still a Europe that will have to struggle to find its consistency internally on its values and also its unity of purpose on its own principles and interests. And a Europe that will probably struggle to find the adequate tools to play at the level of its ambitions. Maybe one last word talking about ambitions on the level of ambition. This is probably not for the next 40 years, I think, and I hope this is a debate that is more for the next 40 months. And that is the debate about European defense, the work that the European Union can do on security, and the concept of strategic autonomy. I think that, maybe we can come back to that during the discussion, but I think that both Pierre and Jim will remember this very well. In 2016, when we worked on the global strategy, we referred to the concept of strategic autonomy clearly. That was quite controversial, but it was probably the cornerstone of what then we built in terms of European defense. And even if it was controversial, I like to remind ourselves that all the work we've done 2017, 2018, 19 on the European defense has been done by unanimity still at 28 and after the Brexit referendum. So just en passant, still unanimity voting is possible if political will is there on priority issues, for sure. The concept of strategic autonomy, I think, is sometimes used ideologically or instrumentally for one political agenda or the other. I think that if you look at the reality of it and its etymology, it refers very basically to the fact that any player, any actor on the global scene, including the European Union, has the right to define by itself its own norms and rules. This is the meaning, the etymological meaning of autonomy, the possibility, the capacity to define your own rules and norms. And the opposite of it would be that somebody else does it for you elsewhere, which is, by the way, what happens sometimes when we have extraterritorial sanctions adopted in Washington and that have an impact on European businesses and banks. That is definitely not an autonomous way of defining your norms and rules. So that is maybe an issue to tackle. This to say, strategic autonomy, I believe, is a natural development for Europe. It would, I think, be strange not to work on it, but I would frame it in two ways. First, that it doesn't refer only to security and defense issues. It refers also to the way in which we play our role as Europeans, for instance, in the domain of economy and finances, the use of the currency, our banking system, our trade system, political choices. To me, an act of strategic autonomy was the moment when the European Union member states decided to back the existence of the nuclear agreement with Iran when Washington was deciding in a different direction. In that moment, we exercised strategic autonomy politically. And by the way, this is also what allows today the US administration to rejoin negotiations. So it was an act of strategic autonomy that was also an investment for our partners that were thinking differently at the time. And I would frame it as a cooperative autonomy. I think that being able to define your own norms and act independently if needed, defining yourself, your values, your compass somehow, is not to be taken as an act of hostility towards anyone else. On the contrary, I would always define strategic autonomy as a cooperative autonomy. I think it's in the DNA of the European Union to always look for partnership, and in particular with the natural allies of the European Union, namely the United States, the UN system, NATO. But I think that it is even more valuable, the contribution that a player like the European Union can bring worldwide if it is based on a serious and solid assessment of what your compass is in terms of values and interests. And I think that partner on the world scene, especially a turbulent world scene like the one that we will face from now to the next decades, a partner that is solid in its beliefs is a much more valuable partner than one that doesn't have clear its sense of direction. I'll stop here and I look forward to hearing comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'll come back now into the room to invite Jim Cloos, who's now president of TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, and he's also at Egmont, to comment on a number of those points. And Jim, during your many years in the Council of the European Union, you both invented and shaped concepts such as strategic autonomy, and I know you have strong views on this. They are also concepts which sometimes clarify things, and they quite often allow for consensus that papers over cracks between the member states. And as a drafter of many council conclusions, you know well how they can be used. Is there a danger that strategic autonomy is essentially strategic ambiguity? It allows member states to seem to agree when they don't really, and especially when what Federica Mogherini just referred to as the values compass is severely challenged, and member states feel extremely awkward and even embarrassed about the behavior of their fellow members, but dare not say so. Is strategic autonomy a way of avoiding the challenges, or is it a way of tackling them?
Thanks. I'm very pleased to be here and say hello to Federica and Pierre Vimont. I definitely don't think that strategic autonomy is about what you just said. I think strategic autonomy, the way I define it, is a no-brainer. If you listen to what Federica just had to say about the challenges, and if you read Florence Kaup's report, it is about our capacity to act, it is about our resilience, and it is about understanding the future. So I do not see it, because the term strategic is being employed, a lot of people think military and defense. That's the last part of what we are supposed to do. We also have to address it, but that's a longer term perspective because of our history, because of NATO, the transatlantic relationship. So it's very clear, if you listen, if you look at the present day challenges, if you look at the way the world's evolving, including the United States, and if you look at the crisis, which Federica has mentioned, which hit us over the last few years, it is clear that the Union has to become stronger and has to become more active and more capable of shaping the world. Now, in order to do that, I think you need several things. The first one is happening to some extent after 2016, when Brexit and Trump together combined to show to the Europeans that they had to simply take matters into their hands. It is to understand the world as it is, to look at the world how it is, not as we think it should be. The second idea is we have to think about our place on the chessboard. Now, you mentioned the question of ambiguity, geostrategic ambiguity. I suppose some people use this because they want to say that if we do not slavishly follow everything the Americans do, then we are opting for ambiguity. That's completely wrong. In terms of the part where we are rival with China, we're not rivals with the United States, so it's the wrong way of putting this. But if at the same time we should not just become a junior partner and say anything the Americans do is in our interest, we will follow them. So yes, we need some autonomy there too. I think I very deeply believe in that. And we also have to look at the question of interests and values. We tend to say values, values, values. I'm all for European values. Well, the European values after the Second World War, not before the Second World War. I'm all for them. But you need to defend your interests. Because if you don't defend your interests in the world with China, Russia, Turkey, and all the others, you're going to lose your interests and your values. Now, second point on strategic autonomy, it's about content. I mentioned it. It is about all our policies. You have to look at it, climate change, digital, and all of this. And to some extent also security. I think we need to develop a better method about this. And this is, we have to look at our policies and do a cost-benefit analysis. Where are we weak? Where are we strong? Where should we invest more? And where should we diversify? The answer can be diversification. It can be more production in Europe. It can be many other things. This is something we have to do. It's a bit like Jean Monnet with his bilan, which he made before the Second World War, and say he was looking at steel and coal and other issues and say, what is our capacity to produce? How much do we need and all that? We need this more sophisticated across the board. Finally, I would say in terms of governance, we have to find a way that first the institutions really work together on that. That is why I like ESPAS so much, because it was a very good way of making us work together. We also have to work with private industry. We have to work with think tankers. I've now become a kind of think tanker, like also Federica and Pierre. It's quite a change from before. But I think it's good to mix practitioners with think tanking. And we have to get the think tankers to be more real, to work more on the basis of what we need for European Union and to help us establish those balance sheets and all of that. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I mean, these are really fundamental questions about the capacity of the European Union as a really unique political system and the challenges that proposes as an external actor in the world. I'd like to bring in Pierre Vimont, a very distinguished French diplomat who, of course, was the Secretary General of the European External Action Service for 5 years during one of the long series of crises that we've had. And I'd like to ask you about this whole question of crisis response, and we've heard both from Federica and from Jim the crises that we're likely to face in the future, which are, following financial crisis, Euro crisis, migration and asylum, then COVID. We're likely to face a number of more that will be both global in nature and have a particularly big impact in Europe. How can we move to more of a systemic approach to instability? Do we have to wait till the crisis comes along to grab the attention of the heads of state and government in the European Council, which has become a crisis management body in itself? Are there ways in which we can plan for that and think about systemic responses to instability? For example, having as part of our strategic autonomy, maintaining more of the earth being habitable for human beings so that the displacement of people that Federica Mogherini was referring to is actually less, so that people can still live in the regions where they currently are rather than having to move. One example. Another example is as we see trade flows being disrupted because of geopolitical tensions and so on, that disrupts supply chains, which has an immediate and direct effect on the European economy and on livelihoods here in Europe. Are these the kinds of issues we should be looking at? And how would we do that in a more systematic way rather than lurching from crisis to crisis?
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for inviting me to the ESPAS conference. I feel in a bit of an awkward position as I'm being asked to make comments on what Federica just said. You know, Federica was my boss, so I find it a bit strange to be in this upside down situation where I'm supposed to comment what she has said. But let me go back to the question you just raised and maybe open it a little bit with what is being done by ESPAS, this foresight vision of things and the way the work done by ESPAS, the very good report made by Florence Gaub, forces us to look at the future and to try to anticipate the future, which is more or less the question you're asking, how to anticipate and avoid being always in a sort of crisis management mode. And this is what has always been, to me, a very important question when you are a practitioner. Because in fact, we have very good reports, paper on foresight, warning signals that come time and again. And the reality is that we're not lacking the information. We're lacking the road to action, as we could say in France, le passage à l'acte. We know we can anticipate, and yet we don't do it for many different reasons that are sometimes difficult to pinpoint exactly. Think about what we've gone through for the last 2 years, the pandemic. In fact, we had many warnings about what was about to come. We had Bill Gates making these famous speeches warning us about what was about to come. We even had a movie or 2 movies about it all. So we can't say we were not informed, and yet we seem to be taken somewhat by surprise. Even to go closer to the kind of work we did with Federica in the External Action Service, or even before Federica came, on the way to negotiate the association agreement with Ukraine. We knew that we were on very difficult grounds, and many of us thought that we needed to find a way of managing Russia's growing irritation and frustration with what was going on. And yet nothing really happened. And we went right into the wall with the Crimea annexation and Russian intervention in Donbass. Not to say that we are the only ones to be blamed for that. But my point is a larger one, is about how do we try to take into account what we get from the think tanks, from very good reports from ESPAS, from the policy planning staff working all over the EU, 27 member states, foreign affairs ministries, track 2 discussions whose conclusions are being brought to us. How come that we're not able to move in the right direction once we get all these warnings? I think it has to do to a large extent with difficulty to manage our time. Federica knows better than any one of us how the time pressure is on all of us when we are dealing with everyday foreign policy issues. There may be also the risk of taking unpopular decisions from time to time. There may be the comfort zone where bureaucrats love to stay. And there may be also, and this is a point I think we need to raise at some point, it's the difficulty to be innovative and to find new ideas sometimes. When we're facing stubborn opponents or competitors who are sticking to quite often a very confrontational approach, we don't know exactly how to manage this. Because it's not in the DNA of the European Union. Look at its long legacy, historical legacy. It was not in the mindset of the European Union to stand up to these kinds of challenges that we're facing. Never forget that Europe came out of World War I and World War II with the idea of pushing back against nationalism, going for an ideal of a multilateral approach and multilateral dialogue. And therefore, it's a whole change of mindset and mentality that we have to go through. I think sometimes we haven't paid enough tribute to Federica's efforts through the 2016 global strategy she was mentioning a few minutes ago about strategic autonomy. But there was another principle that she put forward, which was, if I remember well, principle pragmatism, which was this idea of bringing in the simple concept that with all the usual defense and promotion of principles and values that the EU cherishes, there was also the need to be a little bit more pragmatic and to invent new ways of pushing forward a European foreign policy that should find its own brand in some extent, and to be more proactive, more swift, more agile, more nimble than it has been in the past. And I think to answer your question, Heather, I think at the end of the day, it's about this. It's about how does the European Union manage to be more proactive than it has been in the past. It's a lot of work. It's about revisiting sometimes the toolbox. It's about changing the mentality. This is an ongoing process, and it has already started, I think. And if we look at some of the propositions put on the table by the European Commission and the External Action Service on the new trade policy, on the new competition policy, on digital services and market, on climate change, the strategic compass, both Federica and Jim were alluding to, we're moving in the right direction. But there's still a lot of homework, I guess. I'll stop there, Heather. I've been quite too long.
Thank you very much. A great deal there, and some complementarity in what the three of you have said about the need for Europe to be more proactive and to equip itself to do that more effectively. One of the greatest drags on that is not resources. There are fantastic human resources at EU level. We have all these great institutions. We also have all of the complementary thinking and strategic advice from everything from think tanks to policy planners to civil society, of course, as Pierre said. And yet somehow the move to action is difficult. And yet now is also the moment when there's a real opportunity to move with the United States, with Joe Biden in the White House. This will not last forever. And there's an interesting question that's come from the audience concerning this. The question reads, has the time come for a new strategic alliance of the world's democracies? What is Europe's role in it? Well, that question could go in one of two directions. One direction would be to say, oh, wow, it's difficult enough just to get the 27 member states together, let alone trying to get all of the world's democracies to be strategic together. And, of course, the whole concept of democracy is now very much challenged in Europe, and one of the EU's member states has not been invited by Joe Biden to that summit because of not being considered to be sufficiently democratic anymore, and that's Hungary. So this question of how do you have a strategic alliance of democracies, it's extremely timely, because we might be in a rather short period of time when it's possible to have that kind of alliance with the US again. Let's see what happens after the next election or even after the midterms on capacity of the United States to act. And yet it's also something that's clearly urgent to tackle these challenges. So I'd like to come back to you, Rector Mogherini, for your views on this. Is it about democracy that binds and leads towards potentially a joint strategic vision, or is it actually about those who are willing and able to act on the challenges which are most important for Europe's own values compass, as you said?
Well, I believe that I still believe in principled pragmatism that Pierre Vimont recalled a few minutes ago. I think that was one of the definitions or the concept that was more interesting to have in the global strategy in 2016. And indeed, I think that we're still there. This is quite good, I think, in the sense of matching the defense of interests, as Jim Cloos mentioned, with the compass of our values and the basic principles of our rule of law systems and our constituencies that are based in open societies. I think that this combination of realism and pragmatism on one side and plus the compass of principles and values and the interests that need to be defended would require a little bit more articulated and complex system of alliances. Obviously, I think that after the global trends that we've seen lately in the last few years, now contained, but still very much there, not only in Europe, elsewhere in the world, in every continent, we have had or we have currently trends that are producing a shrinking space for human rights, democracy, and rule of law, and we have some authoritarian trends across the globe, in all continents. I think that after these years, obviously symbolically and politically, I see the value of an alliance of democracies worldwide, but in practical terms, to move to the action, as Pierre was mentioning, I think that the pragmatic way to go would rather be to have a certain variety of alliances on different topics and different themes. In my experience, what has worked is a very pragmatic approach to a country-to-country partnership and a theme-by-theme partnership. You can be partner with a certain number of countries in the world on one particular issue, being it trade, being it human rights, being it death penalty, on which for Europeans is a fundamental value and principle, but not so much for the United States, for instance. So defining a common Bible of democracies, I think might bring us in a complicated direction. While I think that on certain issues, what is the alliance that you can build globally on climate change? What is the alliance you can build globally on promoting human rights? What is the alliance you can build globally on free and fair trade, and so on and so forth? Or the global alliance we will need to build for vaccines, because it's quite clear now that unless we manage to vaccinate the rest of the world, we will stay trapped in this no matter how many doses we get in Europe. So I think that a more pragmatic way to go, a more effective way to go might be, and even in parallel with the alliance of democracies, that might make sense, again, politically and as a statement. But I think what would be effective on the policy making could be a variety of alliances, issue by issue, with those countries, with those organizations, and even international powers, because power is not only state power any longer. There's also movements of opinions and civil society organizations, business organizations that can be part of a specific fight, of a specific alliance for a specific purpose. And the combination of this puzzle can actually, I think, lead the world to a better, or at least a sustainable future. Again, the declaration of principle and the symbolism of a democratic alliance or democracy, of alliance of democracies worldwide, I think it has its values, especially now, especially coming from the United States, where you're perfectly right, midterms elections coming up, and I think that this is something we need as Europeans to keep in mind. And I'll finish on this. You know, we have been used since thousands of years, but with relevant moments of blackout. And Jim was referring to the fact that we we are all for the European values, but the post-Second World War values. But since thousands of years, we Europeans are used to refer ourselves as the place where democracy was born, and today as the place where democracy is practiced. True, as well as we've always been referring to the United States as sometimes the largest democracy in the world. And yet, just a few months ago, just at the beginning of this year, we've seen challenges in the US democracy that made us raise some doubts about the resilience of the democratic system in the largest democracy of the world. And we see in European soil some challenges clearly coming up. So I think that we can be quite adamant on the fact that nobody has the license of democracy once and for all. And I think that we should avoid having this assumption as Europeans or as the West, also because this might push other countries and other parts of the world to doubt about the reality of it and also about the value of democracy in itself. Because if they see the contradictions, if they see the violations of human rights in places that advocate for democracy and human rights in words but not maybe in actions, then the values and the principles get weakened as well.
Thank you very much. So to come back into the room, Jim, what do you think about this idea about variable geometry in terms of alliances on issues? Are they sustainable enough to bring real progress? Are they things that are too subject to changes of government, changes of mind, not following through on commitments? Or is this a way forward?
Heather, I think we don't have a choice, to be honest. And I very much agree with what Federica said. I am all for a moral compass. We need one. But to me, that doesn't mean alliance for democracies. I'm a bit reticent vis-à-vis this term. Why? Because it's an ideological term. I see two problems. The one is, are we going to reconstitute the West against the rest? If we do that, you can be almost certain that you will have Russia and China getting closer together. Is that what Europe wants? I have my doubts, and of course I'm a fan of democracy. The second point is one which Federica made. If you want to solve climate change, well, you can do it with the democracies. And you leave outside China, which is responsible for more than 30% of the emissions. We account for less than 8%, and the Americans for 13 to 14%. So you have to know what you want. So the idea that you need variable alliances is a no-brainer. Of course you have to do it. And you cannot just say, we sit together with democracies. Incidentally, the way you define the democracies is a complicated one. I don't know whether some countries I have in mind are being invited to this summit or not. So I do not think this is the right way, to be very honest. I think it's an ideological way. I think we should definitely stand for our values. But if I take, for instance, our sanctions policy, I think we have transformed this into a kind of policy rather than an instrument. And it should be an instrument for what? My personal view is that it should be an instrument if our vital interests are being attacked, and then we should use it. I'm not entirely certain that it's the best instrument to try to impose values. Thank you.
This is a really fundamental point, because if we look at the instruments that the European Union has at its disposal, sanctions are an important one. They're also one of the ones where it's often difficult to get agreement among the member states to use them. And so this question of competence comes up again and again, also in terms of the external alliances. So, Pierre, could I bring you in on this question as well? How far alliances, variable alliances, are the way of the future, and whether they should be defined on the basis of a country being a democracy or not, and also on effectiveness. You've seen many alliances come and go, and we in Europe weren't terribly keen on certain alliances, like those that were supposed to be against the axis of evil and the coalitions of the willing for intervention, which not all of our member states wanted to join in the past when the Americans attempted to lead them. How should we deal with alliances in this very complex world?
I think, Heather, as it was underlined by both Federica and Jim, we have to look at our own interest. And this should be the guideline for our decision about whether to join such and such alliance. It's about European interest. when these alliances are fit for our own interest, we should go there, and we should try to play a major role if we can. Be active, take the lead whenever we can. The main risk for the European Union, in my opinion, in the years ahead, is one of a gradual irrelevance, because we would not be effective enough, because we would have no voice on the international scene as we are confronted with global powers using more and more the means of force, of power politics, etc. This is really where it lies. So when we are in face of an alliance or a draft alliance or project of an alliance, let's look at what it stands for, where it is in our interest. And if we think it is useful to go there, let's go there and try to shape it according to our interests. This alliance of democracy, in my opinion, and I'm very much in agreement with Jim on this point, looks very much like a new platform for the Western countries and the Western alliance against all the others. And this is exactly where I think we should try to avoid moving towards, because we are facing a situation with the whole multilateral order we have built up after 1945 is now being contested, undermined by many of the other partners, other countries that are non-West countries, because they think this system has been more and more unfair to them. And we have to take that into account. And we have to be careful not to stick and go along the old lines of Western foreign policy. We need to take into account the criticism we hear more and more from the other side and adapt to a new reality where we must give up some of the ideas we had and some of the strong position we had in this multilateral system and give room to others as they want to have a greater voice in the world affairs, and rightly so.
Thank you very much. Very important considerations. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and I cannot resist the temptation of asking the three of you who've worked within institutional and political constraints during critical periods when you really wanted to get things done, and it was just impossible to do so. So could I ask you to pay a bit of fantasy EU? If there was one thing that you could change in the EU system, regardless of the political impossibility and the institutional constraints and the laws and the acquis communautaire and so on, there was one thing in the EU system that you would change to make the EU much better equipped to deal with risks and challenges ahead, what would it be? And it can be anything. It could be procedural, unanimity, can be in terms of equipment and the kinds of defense union ideas, can really be anything. But what is the one thing that you think would really make a big difference? You're all cogitating. Jim?
For me, it's not an institutional answer, because I think our institutional system is what it is. I don't think it's that bad. You've seen it during the crisis, as Federica pointed out. We managed quite well. It is about political will. It's about seeing the world as it is. And it's about asking the difficult strategic questions. I yesterday was at a dinner where someone said we should ask the what-if questions. What if the United States walks out of NATO, for instance? So everything we do now for defense, I mean, it should basically work towards NATO and strengthen our alliance. I'm very much in favor of that, don't misunderstand me. But what if? Well, then it's the reassurance policy. So for me, the most important thing is psychological, it's the frame of mind. All the rest will follow.
Okay, so mindset is the first one. Federica?
I was thinking, because indeed, also on my side, I have to say, I wouldn't change, out of my experience, I wouldn't change anything on the institutional side, and for sure not the unanimity rule. This opens a different debate, but I'm out of the mainstream here, and I'm very much in favor of the unanimity rule on foreign and security policy. But this is, again, another conversation. So I wouldn't change anything in the institutional setup. What I would change is the sense of ownership that especially political leaderships have of the European Union. The limits I have experienced and the frustrations I have experienced, not many, I have to admit, during my 5 years in office, but the little ones I had were concerning situations where member states in particular, but also other institutions possibly, were acting in reality in a different manner than the one decided collectively at the European level. And this disconnection between the formal common decision and the actual national policies is, to me, the thing to change to make Europe function properly.
I think we could call this free riding by member states. So we have mindset, we have free riding. Pierre, what would be your one big change?
I think following on what Jim said about the need to change the mindset, that would be for me the first priority. But then I would add something more. The capacity for the institution to act with more flexibility than it is the case at the moment, because as Federica was saying, unanimity will remain. And of course, if we can't reach unanimity at some point, we need to find a way of getting a more flexible approach to the challenges we're facing. And therefore, inside the institutional framework of the EU, because I think we have to stay inside the institutional framework, we should be able to have a little bit more flexibility to allow those who really want to move forward to be able to do that quickly, swiftly, and in a more effective way than it is the case at the moment. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much. So if we think about a flexible, solidaire mindset at European level, we might see a much better European Union equipped for the future. Thank you, all three of you, very much. And I think that we will go to the next session. I think it's pretty immediate because all of this being online, there's no lunch break. But you've certainly given everyone excellent food for thought. Thanks to you all.
Thank you.